Earlier this week, I officiated at a funeral for a 98-year-old woman, a longtime member of this congregation. One of the things that struck me about her family's eulogies and the stories they told me when we met before the funeral is that Ida, the child of immigrants whose family received much assistance to come and settle and live in the United States, she never forgot that, and throughout her lifetime provided assistance to others, both the family back in the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, and actively helping immigrants here in the United States to get settled, get clothing, seek work, build lives. What also struck me was that her family, at least her sons, and I think her grandchildren, knew this. They knew what she did and why she did it. On Sunday, I did what I often do at a funeral, which is perhaps redundant, but I do it anyway. I ask the families to not only live the lessons of the deceased, which they're so often doing, but to name them explicitly. To say, I give this act of tzedakah, I support this agency, I light Shabbat candles this way, I make this recipe, whatever it is, because my mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, dear friend did this. Not just to think it in our heads, but to name it aloud. Time and again, we, your rabbis and cantor, meet with students whose parents and families also do remarkable acts of kindness. It's often when we're meeting with families before bar and bat mitzvah services. And sometimes the children know what their parents do, and often they don't. And a lot of that's age-related, right? The average 12 or 13-year-old's not really paying so much attention to what their parents do. There's no fault, but often also the parents may do pro bono work or be involved in the community, give charitably, and do so many things, but don't necessarily think to name what they do explicitly at home. They just do it because it's part of them. Life is busy and we do what we do. And when our students find out, there's often eye-opening realization and even inspiration. We've all heard our students have some amazing awareness of family history and family acts, family kindness. So too when children or adults find out about their namesakes. Right? So many of us, not me, I should say, but many of us are named for people. And we might know who we're named for, we might not even. But do we know why? Yes, someone so loved that person, but what did they do in their life? What was their history? What are their acts that meant something? What are the traits and actions that we want those we name after them to continue? Some years ago, the author Bruce Feiler, in an essay entitled "The Stories That Bind Us," explained research findings that he uncovered in his book, a book that came out a number of years ago, you may have seen it, "The Secrets of Happy Families." Feiler explains, the single most important thing you can do for your family may be the simplest of all. Develop a strong family narrative. This teaching, emanating from the work of psychologists Drs. Marshall and Sarah Duke, who saw that, as Dr. Sarah Duke explained, the students, in their research, the students who know a lot about their families tend to do better when they face challenges. Dr. Marshall Duke and his colleague, Dr. Robin Fivish, set out to explore this finding. They developed a measure that they called Do You Know? A scale that asked children to answer 20 questions. Examples included, do you know where your grandparents grew up? Do you know where your mom and dad went to high school? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know an illness or something really terrible that happened in your family? Do you know the story of your birth? Dr. Duke and Dr. Fivish asked these questions of 46 families back about 20 years ago now, in 2001, and they taped several of the dinner conversations. They compared the children's results to a battery of psychological tests the children had taken, and they reached an overwhelming conclusion. The more children knew about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believed their families functioned. The do you know scale turned out to be the best single predictor of children's emotional health and happiness. They found out that knowing your narrative, whether it's what they call ascending, like everything gets good, or descending, things get worse and worse and worse, is what matters. It doesn't matter what the narrative is, it's that you know it. Ultimately, as Filer cites, the most healthful narrative is the third kind, which is what's called an oscillating family narrative, which has the ups and the downs. Dear, let me tell you, we've had our ups, we've had our downs. We built a family business. Your grandfather was a pillar of the community. Your mother was on the board of the hospital, but we had setbacks. You had an uncle who was arrested. You had a house burned down. Your father lost a job, but we stuck together as a family. Example he gave. Dr. Duke said that the children who have the most self-confidence have what he and Dr. Fivish called a strong intergenerational self. They know they belong to something bigger than themselves. Their research dovetails truly with Torah. We read this week in Deuteronomy, "Do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and to your children's children." And to be fair, Torah is talking particularly about the awesome moments, like Sinai and the giving of Torah. But clearly telling and retelling our narratives gives such an oscillating family narrative. The ups and downs, the moments of faith and doubt, utter kvetching, like our ancestors did, they didn't like food, they wanted to be back in Egypt, they didn't like water, etc., and yet they moved forward toward the promised land. And as Torah commentary explains, this is the most pervasive expression of the biblical conviction that religion is not only personal, but must be transmitted to next generations, so they too can share in the experiences. And by the way, this is not just to our own offspring. This is to our community, to our students, to anyone on whom we have an impact, the ability to teach. And it's also not limited to literal children. Whatever our age, when we recall the family narratives of our Jewish people, of our own families, we gain connectedness and perspective for our individual journeys. So how do we do it? Looking out, I know so many of your stories, and many of you we're living that, but still, we can all do more, certainly me included. I invite you to look around, maybe here, more likely at home. Look around at the objects before you. Consider the photographs. Remember the stories, even if they're incomplete. I'm sure that at some point, every one of us in the room wished that we had asked one more question or 10 more questions to people who are no longer alive. I don't know that whole story. I don't really know where they came from, or I wish I asked that. So what? Think about what you do know. Think about why you give tzedakah. What is that recipe you make for Pesach? Who inspired you to plant your garden? Listen to classical music. Read. Help a neighbor. Go on that trip. Consider what you do and what you've learned. And what are the stories that you've internalized so much that you don't say them out loud because they're writ large and really loud in good ways in your mind. Then think about what stories you do tell. Think about what you need to tell. Ask yourself, what do I need to tell but I never have? Because it's in my brain, I know it. And who in my family is named for someone I can tell them stories about? Or what friend? And then be explicit, just like I told that family on Sunday. Explain the names, the objects, the photographs, the actions, the recipes. Say whose legacy they are. Say out loud what you do and for whom or because of whom. A reminder how to do this comes in another very familiar part of this week's Torah portion. I'll read it to you, and I think you'll recognize it. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 6, "You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions I charge you this day. Teach them to your children, recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and you rise up. Bind them as a sign upon your hand, let them be a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Sound familiar? We know that passage is via Havta, or the second paragraph of the Shema. And it has literal meaning, saying Shema, teaching our children, putting up a mezuzah, laying tefillin. It also has metaphorical meaning, putting Judaism before our eyes, visible in our homes, as signs on our hands. What do we do with our hands to express our Judaism? In other words, teaching our children of any age, teaching ourselves, and teaching our community is in our hands, for us to say and show explicitly each and every day, when we lie down, when we rise up, morning and evening, and throughout the day. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Shabbat Shalom.